It's already hard to accept that my father-in-law passed away. But what my husband Bob said next left me completely shocked. Let's get divorced. Now that I've got the inheritance, I don't need you to be my ATM anymore. For a moment, I couldn't believe what Bob was saying. What do you mean? I asked. Bob grinned and smugly explained, I have about $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Then Bob started complaining about me. Do you know how embarrassed I've been? I had high hopes because my dad arranged our marriage, but I was disappointed to end up with someone as plain as you. Well, why did you marry me then? You could have just said no, I replied. It's obvious, isn't it? For the money. Who else would marry someone like you? I couldn't stay silent after hearing that. Fine, here's the divorce papers. I decided to agree to the divorce without telling Bob something important. I hope he regrets this deeply later. My name is Catherine Smith, and I'm 42 years old. I run a fashion company. I married Bob, who is 2 years younger than me, 2 years ago. Our marriage was arranged. Bob is the son of Mr. Smith, the CDO of a company I've worked with for many years. Being an only child, it seemed Mr. Smith initially intended for Bob to succeed him, but Bob showed no interest and wasn't particularly good at his job. So Bob quickly dropped out of the running for successor and just worked as a regular employee. What attracted me to Bob? His laid-back nature. Since childhood, people often told me I was too serious and lacked spontaneity. I was often praised for being studious, but some people found me too stiff. Some of my ex-boyfriends even told me, "You're not fun, it's like I'm dating a boss." It was heartbreaking, but I always felt maybe I was too serious. Being labeled as inflexible was a common occurrence. I struggled with handling things casually and often got too engrossed. To me, Bob seemed like he was from a completely different world. "Oh, the place is closed today," Bob said during our first date. He had recommended a restaurant, but it was closed when we got there. Now, I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. "Let's just go to that diner over there," he said, effortlessly changing plans. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. "Are you sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him," he asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth. But maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith asked him why, Bob casually said, "Why do I need to work if you are making money for both of us?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback that we didn't know what to say. Why would he rely solely on me for income? "Oh, the place is closed today," Bob said during our first date. He had recommended a restaurant, but it was closed when we got there. Now, I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. "Let's just go to that diner over there," he said, effortlessly changing plans. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. "Are you sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him," he asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth. But maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith asked him why, Bob casually said, "Why do I need to work if you are making money for both of us?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback that we didn't know what to say. Why would he rely solely on me for income? I tried to convince Bob many times with the help of my father-in-law, but Bob's way of thinking never changed. "Even if I work, I can't earn as much as Catherine does," he'd say. Right after we got married, Bob boldly declared he'd be a freeloader, and I was tempted to divorce him then and there. If he was a young man in his 20s, maybe I would have found it cute. But this attitude was coming from a man nearing 40. Eventually, we reluctantly agreed that he'd take care of the household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier. Apparently, before the divorce, Bob's mother wasn't very good at housework. She couldn't do anything, so I never learned from her, Bob said. It seemed like Bob was making excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. True to his word, initially, Bob was clueless about housework. but with consistent praise and guidance, he managed to handle basic tasks. However, that doesn't mean he became exceptionally good at it. Still, he seemed quite pleased with himself. Thanks to me taking care of the house, Catherine can work. You should be grateful, Bob would say confidently, which often bothered me. But I didn't think it was worth arguing over. Yes, Bob, I really appreciate your help, I'd reply, forcing a smile. There were moments when I felt annoyed, but overall, I think we managed to get along quite well. About a year into our marriage, something significant happened. My father-in-law adopted a child, a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack seemed like an ordinary boy, but my father-in-law isn't someone who makes decisions without reason. So why did he suddenly adopt Jack? One day, when we were alone, I asked him. He replied, "Promise you won't tell anyone," and then explained. It turns out Jack was the child of an employee my father-in-law was fond of. They had a close relationship, but tragically, Jack's parents died in an accident. They had eloped, and Jack didn't have any close relatives to rely on. Otherwise, he would have ended up in foster care. While my father-in-law wasn't sure if Jack would be happy with us, he decided to adopt him, hoping it would be for the best. I see, that's very kind of you. Although Bob and I didn't have children, we had quite a bit of freedom. Please rely on me if you need anything, I said. My father-in-law smiled warmly upon hearing this. Thankfully, afterward, he did rely on me from time to time, just as I had offered. On nights when he couldn't make it back from work or had pressing commitments, I took care of Jack. At first, Jack was a bit hesitant, but he quickly warmed up to me. He's either very friendly or trying hard to fit in. Thinking about it made me feel somewhat emotional. Bob, on the other hand, wasn't happy about the situation. It seemed he wasn't welcoming toward Jack. I could understand his mixed feelings, knowing his father took in a stranger, but when I tried talking to Bob, it turned out he had a completely different concern. Adopting him? What's he thinking? This is going to cut into my inheritance. I was hoping to get everything, he said. I couldn't believe my ears. Bob wasn't conflicted about Jack, he was worried about the inheritance. I'm going to talk to Dad about this. I'm not cool with it. One day, Bob said this and went to confront his father. When he returned after a while, to my surprise, he was in a strangely good mood. I cautiously asked a smiling Bob, "How did it go?" He replied, "Oh, it's all good. My share isn't changing." Huh? What do you mean? I asked. I always thought that even if someone is adopted, they still get the same stuff from family when someone dies. What's happening? Noticing I didn't understand, Bob explained proudly, "Dad's making Jack give up his right to get stuff when he's gone. It's because I'm his real son." I was surprised. Could the father-in-law who talked about Jack so nicely really be planning to give him nothing? Something seemed wrong. I wasn't sure, but Bob seemed happy about it, saying, "I'm glad. Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason. Anyway, he's still young. We won't deal with his stuff for a long time. Maybe I'd divorce Bob before then, who knows?" I was thinking about this casually, but things changed quickly. A year later, my father-in-law had an accident and didn't come back. I didn't expect to lose him so soon. I knew him longer than I knew Bob. He was a good man in his job and at home. Hearing the news was sad. I couldn't stop crying, feeling a deep sense of loss. My eyes were swollen, and my head hurt, but I made myself get ready for the funeral. Bob was supposed to be the one mourning the most, but he seemed distant, like he wasn't really feeling it. His dad had died suddenly. Maybe he was so shocked he couldn't believe it was happening. So, I took charge to organize everything for my father-in-law's farewell since Bob seemed distant. During the funeral, I held back my tears as best I could, but the hardest part was seeing Jack cry. Bob, on the other hand, didn't shed a tear. I found it strange. Instead of being sad, he seemed fidgety or even happy. Later, I figured out why. "Bob, something seems off with you. Aren't you sad about your dad?" I wanted to express my worry about his lack of tears, but his response surprised me. "Oh, I'm definitely sad, but I'm also kind of excited." "Oops, I guess I let that slip, huh?" He chuckled. "Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He must have left a lot of money. How much do you think he left behind?" I thought Bob was just lost in thought, but from before the funeral until now, he hadn't shown any grief for his father. He was smiling, thinking about the money he'd inherit. "What's gotten into you?" I exclaimed. "Well, think about it. We're divorced, and my mom isn't getting any of it. I'm his only real child. Jack, being adopted, won't get any inheritance, so it's all mine. You think I can't be happy about that?